Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know the places and times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The carriage wheels made a distinctive sound against the gravel path leading up to the Duval plantation house. It was late spring of 1842, and the air hung heavy with humidity that seemed to trap every sound close to the ground. The Savannah River was visible from the upper windows of the grand white-columned mansion, its waters reflecting the last remnants of daylight as the sun descended behind the moss-laden oak trees. Margaret Eliza Duval stood at the window of what the household staff called the Mistress's parlor, a room she had claimed as her private sanctuary since her marriage to Clarence Duval 4 years prior. According to county records, Margaret was 26 years old when the events began to unfold, a woman born to the wealthy cotton merchant family of the Hendersons from Charleston. Her marriage to Clarence had united two powerful southern dynasties, bringing together substantial landholdings that stretched from the coastal plains to the more fertile interior regions of Georgia. What visitors to the Duval plantation often remarked upon in their correspondence was the unusual quietness of the main house. While neighboring plantations buzzed with the sounds of social gatherings, children, and the constant movement of household servants, Duval Manor maintained an unnerving stillness. The explanation for this peculiarity would become apparent in the months to follow. The Chatham County records show that Clarence Duval, 34 at the time, had inherited the plantation from his father, a man whose reputation for cruelty was documented in several private letters exchanged between local families. The elder Duval had died under what some contemporaries described as curious circumstances, a fall from his horse that occurred with no witnesses present. Clarence had quickly established himself as a different sort of master, one who ruled through calculated control rather than his father's infamous outbursts. It was on May 17th, 1842, according to a diary later discovered hidden beneath floorboards in the east wing of the house, that Sarah Turner's life at Duval Plantation changed irrevocably. Sarah had been born on the property, the daughter of a woman named Esther, who had served as the previous mistress's personal attendant. Sarah's light complexion was noted in inventory records, a single-line item that hinted at the complex and often unspoken lineages that ran through plantation society. By 1842, Sarah had been assigned as Margaret's personal servant, a position that placed her in constant proximity to the mistress and consequently at the center of the household's hidden dynamics. The diary, written in a careful hand that suggests Sarah had received some education despite laws prohibiting the teaching of reading and writing to enslaved people, describes the day Clarence returned from a 2-month business trip to Savannah with news that would set the household on its path to ruin. According to Sarah's account, Margaret had developed a particular attitude toward her over the preceding years. "The mistress takes pleasure in small cruelties," Sarah wrote. "She will ask me to arrange her hair only to declare it ruined and demand I start again. She will send me to fetch something from the far side of the plantation, then claim she never requested it when I return breathless. But it is the mocking that cuts deepest, the way she speaks of my appearance as if I am not present, commenting to visitors about my features as if discussing livestock." The relationship between the two women existed within the brutal power dynamics of the time, but witnesses later interviewed by a northern journalist in 1867 noted that there seemed to be something more personal in Margaret's treatment of Sarah. One former household servant, who remained anonymous in the published account, stated, "Miss Margaret, she watched Sarah like a hawk watches a field mouse. There was something in her eyes when she looked at Sarah. Something that wasn't just the usual way masters look at us. The Duval marriage had produced no children in 4 years, a fact that, according to letters exchanged between Margaret and her sister in Charleston, had become a source of increasing tension. The plantation's ledgers show that Clarence had consulted with 3 different physicians in Savannah, each consultation marked with a discreet notation that suggests the visits concerned fertility matters. It was the evening of Clarence's return, as recorded in Sarah's hidden diary, that the true horror at Duval Plantation began to take shape. The household had prepared a special dinner to welcome the master home. The dining room, with its imported French wallpaper and gleaming silver candelabras, had been arranged to Margaret's exacting specifications. Sarah, as was customary, stood in the corner of the room, ready to attend to any needs that might arise during the meal. Clarence spoke of business for most of the dinner, Sarah wrote. The mistress nodded and smiled, as she always does when he discusses cotton prices and shipping arrangements. It was when the dessert was served that his manner changed. He set down his fork with such purpose that I knew something important was to follow. What Clarence announced that evening would later be corroborated by the family's physician, Dr. Samuel Whitfield, whose medical journal was discovered during renovations to his former Savannah office in 1912. Mr. Duval informed his wife that after extensive consultations, he had received confirmation that the difficulty in producing an heir likely resided with her, not himself. He then declared, with a coldness that apparently silenced even the sounds from the kitchen beyond the dining room door, that he had decided upon a solution. According to Sarah's account, Clarence's eyes shifted to where she stood in the shadowed corner of the room. She began to protest, but he raised his hand in that way he has, the way that stops words in their tracks without him having to raise his voice. What followed was described by Sarah as a discussion of me as if I were a broodmare, with Master Clarence explaining how my mother had given birth to 5 healthy children, how my constitution was strong, how my light skin would make the child more easily accepted. Throughout this conversation, Sarah remained in the corner, invisible as a person but central as an object of their planning. The master said, "Sarah will bear my heir." The mistress's face went as white as the tablecloth. The diary entries become more fragmented in the weeks that followed. Sarah describes being moved from the quarters where she had previously slept to a small room adjacent to the main house, close enough to be summoned, but separate enough to keep her isolated from the other household staff. "The mistress now looks at me with such hatred," she wrote in early June. "Yesterday, as I was arranging her hair for an afternoon visit from the Lawson family, she gripped my wrist so tightly I thought the bone would snap. 'Do not think this elevates you,' she whispered. 'You are nothing but a vessel.'" County records show that in late June, Clarence Duval made a curious purchase, a small cottage property approximately 1 mile from the main plantation house, situated near a bend in the river, where the oak trees grow so densely that even in daylight the path remains in shadow. The transaction was noted in his business ledger with the simple description, "secondary accommodation." It was to this cottage that Sarah was relocated in early July. According to interviews conducted decades later with a former stable hand named Joseph, who was 16 years old at the time, Sarah was taken to the cottage in the master's personal carriage just after sunset. "Miss Margaret stood on the front porch watching them go," Joseph recalled. "Her face was like stone, but her hands kept opening and closing at her sides like she was trying to grab hold of something that wasn't there." The cottage, which remained standing until a fire destroyed it in 1904, was described in a survey document as a modest but well-appointed dwelling with 2 rooms, unusually solid construction, and windows fitted with shutters that close from the outside. This last detail would prove significant in the months to come. What transpired at the cottage was recorded with clinical detachment in Dr. Whitfield's journal. He noted visits to examine Sarah on a weekly basis throughout July and August. On September 3rd, he wrote, "Confirmed pregnancy in the Turner girl." Mr. Duval seemed pleased with the news, instructed on proper care and nutrition to ensure a healthy child. The girl herself remains quiet and compliant, though I note a certain watchfulness in her eyes that is somewhat discomforting. As news of Sarah's condition spread through the whispered networks of the plantation, the atmosphere in the main house reportedly darkened further. According to a letter written by a visiting cousin of Clarence's in October 1842, Margaret had taken to spending hours alone in her parlour, sometimes not emerging even for meals. The cousin wrote to her mother, "There is something deeply troubling about Duval Manor. Clarence seems preoccupied with business and barely acknowledges his wife's increasingly strange behaviour. Margaret herself appears hollow-eyed and distracted. When I asked after her health, she smiled in such a way that I felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. 'I am merely waiting,' she told me, 'for what is mine to return to me.'" The winter of 1842 to 1843 was unusually cold by Georgia standards. The plantation journal kept by the overseer notes that ice formed along the edges of the river for several days in January. Sarah's diary entries from this period reveal her increasing isolation and fear. "The master visits regularly, though he rarely speaks directly to me. He examines my growing body as one might inspect a ripening fruit. Dr. Whitfield comes with his cold hands and colder eyes, but it is the mistress's absence that frightens me most. I have not seen her since I was brought to this place. Yet sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I feel as though she is nearby watching." On February 12th, according to household accounts, Margaret Duval made an unexpected trip to Savannah. She stayed for 3 days, and the purpose of her visit was not recorded in any of the family documents. However, a sales receipt discovered among the papers of a Savannah apothecary shows that a woman matching Margaret's description purchased several herbs known for their medicinal properties, including some that folklore associated with influences on childbirth and fertility. The early spring of 1843 brought unusually heavy rains to the region. The overseer's journal contains numerous entries about flooded fields and concerns for the coming planting season. It was during one such downpour, on the night of March 23rd, that Sarah Turner went into labour. Dr. Whitfield's journal, usually meticulous in its documentation, contains a curious gap. The entry for March 23rd consists of only a single line: "Called to the river cottage after midnight. Situation unexpected." What happened in the cottage that night has been pieced together from fragments of accounts, some contradictory, others suspiciously incomplete. Sarah's diary contains no entries after March 20th. Dr. Whitfield's next substantial entry, dated March 25th, includes the clinical notation: "Mother recovering, child male, apparently healthy, though smaller than expected. Mr. Duval informed." The most troubling account comes from a letter written by a midwife named Rebecca Carter, who was apparently called to assist after Dr. Whitfield arrived at the cottage. The letter, addressed to her sister in Virginia and discovered among family papers in 1929, describes entering the cottage to find a scene of strange tension. "The doctor was flustered in a way I had never seen before," she wrote. The girl was in the final stages of labor, her face contorted not just with the pain of childbirth, but with what looked like terror. And there, in the corner of the room, as still as a statue, sat the mistress of Duval Plantation, watching everything with eyes that never seemed to blink. According to Rebecca's letter, when she asked Dr. Whitfield when Mrs. Duval had arrived, he replied that she hadn't been there when he arrived only 30 minutes earlier. "The strangest part," Rebecca wrote, "was that despite the storm that had turned the roads to mud, Mrs. Duval's dress was perfectly dry. When I commented on this, she smiled and said, "I know paths others don't." The child was born just before dawn on March 24th. Rebecca's letter describes a healthy boy with a full head of dark hair and lungs strong enough to make his protests heard over the storm still raging outside. What happened immediately after the birth, however, remains unclear. Rebecca mentions being asked to leave the room by Dr. Whitfield, who said he needed to complete his examination of mother and child in private. "When I returned to the main room some 10 minutes later," she wrote, "Mrs. Duval was holding the infant, wrapped tightly in a blanket I had not seen before. The doctor was bending over the girl, who appeared to be sleeping deeply." The next documented fact comes from the Duval family Bible, where a birth entry reads, "Charles Henderson Duval, born to Clarence and Margaret Duval, March 24, 1843. There is no mention of Sarah Turner in any official record. The events that followed have been reconstructed from several sources. Clarence Duval announced to his business associates and neighboring plantation owners that his wife had given birth to their son after a difficult pregnancy that had required her seclusion. Few questioned this narrative openly, though private correspondence between local families suggests there was considerable speculation about the sudden appearance of an heir after years of childlessness. What became of Sarah Turner remains one of the most disturbing questions in this account. The plantation records show no further mention of her name after March 1843. She does not appear in subsequent inventory documents, nor is there any record of her being sold to another owner. However, a strange entry appears in Dr. Whitfield's journal on April 2, 1843. Visited Duval Plantation to check on infant's progress, child thriving. Mrs. Duval appears surprisingly recovered and attentive to motherly duties. Upon departure, Mr. Duval requested I examine a matter at the river's edge, where some unusual disturbance of the soil had been noted by field workers. Found nothing of medical significance. Advised matter better addressed by plantation staff. The river cottage remained standing, but apparently uninhabited for several months. According to Joseph, the stable hand, no one was permitted to approach it by direct order of both master and mistress. They said it was because the roof had been damaged in the spring storms, he recalled in his later interview, but none of us ever saw any repairs being done. The place was just left to sit there, empty, but locked up tight. In October 1843, approximately 6 months after the birth, a visitor to Duval Plantation recorded a strange encounter in her private journal. Elizabeth Mercer, a distant cousin of Margaret's from Virginia, wrote, "I have been placed in the East Wing guest room, which offers a clear view of the gardens, and beyond them the path that leads down toward the river. Last night, unable to sleep due to the unusual warmth, I stood by the window hoping to catch a breeze. To my surprise, I saw a figure moving along the path, a woman in a light-colored dress. At first, I thought it must be a servant on some errand, but as the moonlight caught her face, I realized it was Margaret herself. What struck me as odd was not just the late hour of her walk, but the way she moved, with purpose and haste, clutching something to her chest. I mentioned at breakfast that I had seen her walking in the gardens, and the look that passed between her and Clarence sent a chill through me. Margaret quickly explained that she often walks at night when the baby is restless, finding that the motion soothes him back to sleep. But there was no child in her arms when I saw her. Of that I am certain. The child, Charles Henderson Duval, appears to have developed normally according to Dr. Whitfield's notes over the following months. By his first birthday in March 1844, he was described as a robust boy with a serious disposition and unusually penetrating gaze for one so young. It was around this time that the first whispers began about certain similarities between the child and other children born at Duval Plantation in previous years, specifically those who, like Sarah, had been born to women in the quarters. Margaret Duval's behavior during this period took on increasingly peculiar patterns, according to household staff later interviewed. A woman named Lucinda, who served as wet nurse to the child for the first several months, described how Margaret would sometimes stand over the cradle for hours, not speaking or reaching for the baby, just watching him sleep. Sometimes she would whisper things I couldn't quite hear, Lucinda recalled. The only words I ever caught clearly were "mine now," said over and over like a prayer or a spell. Clarence Duval, meanwhile, appeared to withdraw from family life. Business records show increased travel during 1844 and 45, with extended stays in Savannah, Charleston, and even as far north as Richmond. When at the plantation, according to Joseph's account, he avoided the nursery and rarely acknowledged the child that had supposedly been so important to his family line. In the summer of 1845, when Charles was just over 2 years old, a series of unusual incidents began to occur at Duval Manor. The first, documented in a letter from Margaret to her sister, involved the child's behavior. Charles has developed a distressing habit of staring at empty corners of rooms, sometimes extending his small hands as if reaching for something or someone not visible to others. Last Tuesday, I found him in the hallway outside my parlor, having somehow escaped from the nursery, whispering to the empty air. When I asked what he was doing, he looked at me with those solemn eyes and said, "Lady Sad." By fall, according to Lucinda's account, Margaret had forbidden anyone to take Charles near the path leading to the river cottage. "She became hysterical when she found out I had walked that way with the boy one afternoon," Lucinda said. "She struck me across the face, something she had never done before, and screamed that the area was dangerous and no one was to go there, especially not with Charles." It was in November 1845 that the most disturbing incident occurred. A visiting clergyman, Reverend Thomas Blackwood, recorded in his private journal that he had been invited to Duval Plantation to discuss a donation to the church building fund. "I was shown into the main parlor where Mrs. Duval sat with her young son," he wrote. "The boy was quietly playing with wooden blocks on the carpet while his mother and I discussed the church's needs. Our conversation was interrupted when the child suddenly looked toward the doorway and broke into a delighted smile, raising his arms as if asking to be picked up. 'Sarah!' he called out clearly, though there was no one visible in the doorway. Mrs. Duval went rigid in her chair. 'What did you say?' she demanded of the child in such a harsh tone that the boy began to cry. 'Who taught you that name?' she continued, rising to her feet. I attempted to calm the situation, suggesting that he had perhaps heard the name from a household servant, but Mrs. Duval seemed not to hear me. She snatched the child up with such force that he cried out, then ordered me to excuse her and swept from the room. As I gathered my papers to leave, I could hear her voice echoing down the hallway, repeatedly asking who had spoken that name to her son. The question of how Charles would have heard Sarah's name became a source of growing tension within the household. According to Lucinda, Margaret questioned every servant who had contact with the boy, threatening severe punishment for anyone found to have mentioned Sarah Turner to him. "But none of us had," Lucinda insisted years later. "We all knew better than to speak of Sarah. That name had become dangerous at Duval Plantation." In December 1845, parish records show that Margaret Duval approached Reverend Blackwood about performing a blessing ceremony at the plantation house. She appeared greatly disturbed, the Reverend noted in his church record, speaking of negative influences and the need to protect her home and child from unseen forces. While I attempted to counsel her toward more orthodox prayers, she insisted on the full ritual of blessing, including the sprinkling of holy water in every room of the house. The ceremony was performed on December 12th. Household accounts show unusual expenditures for white candles, special salts, and other items requested by Margaret for the occasion. According to Lucinda, Margaret insisted that every door and window in the house remain open during the blessing, despite the winter chill. She said whatever was troubling the house needed a way out, Lucinda recalled. When the Reverend finished his prayers in the nursery, Miss Margaret stood there breathing so hard it was like she'd been running. "It's still here," she kept saying. "I can feel it watching." That night, after the household had retired, an incident occurred that would only be documented much later in a deathbed confession by Joseph the stable hand in 1888. According to his account, he was awakened around midnight by the sound of the mistress's voice calling for a carriage to be prepared. "It was the dead of winter with frost on the ground," Joseph recalled, "but Miss Margaret came to the stables in just her nightdress and a shawl, holding a lantern and looking wild-eyed. She ordered me to prepare the small cart and a single horse immediately. When I asked where she intended to go at such an hour, she said only, 'To finish what should have been finished long ago.'" Joseph described helping Margaret attach the cart to a horse, watching with growing unease as she placed a large bundle in the back, covered with a quilt from the house. "She wouldn't let me drive her," he said. "She took the reins herself and headed down the path toward the river cottage. I was afraid for her in that state, so I followed at a distance on foot, keeping to the shadows of the trees." What Joseph claimed to have witnessed at the cottage has been dismissed by some historians as the embellished recollections of an elderly man, while others point to corroborating physical evidence found years later. According to his account, Margaret Duval arrived at the cottage, secured the horse, and dragged the bundle from the cart into the building. "She had a ring of keys," Joseph said, and seemed to know exactly which one would open the lock that had kept the cottage sealed for over 2 years. Joseph described watching through a window as Margaret moved about inside the cottage, lighting several candles that illuminated the space with flickering shadows. "She unwrapped the bundle, and I saw it contained an axe from the woodshed, several larger knives from the kitchen, and a small shovel. She began tapping on the floorboards in the corner of the room, listening after each tap as if waiting for a particular sound. When she found what she was looking for, she used the axe to pry up the boards. What lay beneath the floorboards, according to Joseph's account, was never clearly seen from his vantage point. He described Margaret kneeling beside the opening, speaking in low tones to whatever lay within. "Her words made no sense to me," he said. "It was like she was having a conversation, pausing as if hearing responses, though I heard nothing but her own voice. She said things like, 'You cannot have him back,' and 'He was never truly yours.'" After some time, Margaret allegedly began to use the small shovel, removing something from beneath the floor and placing it in a sack she had brought with her. Joseph claimed that when she finished, she replaced the floorboards, gathered her tools, and emerged from the cottage. "She looked different," he said, "calmer but somehow empty, like something inside her had been hollowed out. She locked the cottage door, returned to the cart, and drove back toward the main house, this time with the sack beside her on the seat. Joseph followed her to what he described as the deepest part of the marsh, where the ground is never truly solid. There, he claimed to have watched from a distance as Margaret waded into the murky water, dragging the sack behind her until she was waist-deep in the swamp. "She stood there for a long time after the sack had sunk from sight," he said. "The moon was bright enough that I could see her face. She wasn't crying or afraid. She looked satisfied, like someone who has finally solved a difficult problem." The following morning, according to household records, Margaret Duval reported to Dr. Whitfield with complaints of fever and confusion. His journal notes that he prescribed bed rest and a sedative tincture, attributing her condition to female hysteria and the natural anxieties of motherhood. Clarence Duval returned from a business trip 3 days later to find his wife confined to bed and the household in a state of quiet disarray. A letter he wrote to his lawyer in Savannah on December 18th suggests growing concern about Margaret's mental state. My wife's health has taken a worrying turn. While her physical symptoms appear minor, her thoughts and speech have become increasingly disconnected from reality. She speaks of securing our son's place through means I do not comprehend, and has twice asked me to confirm that all traces have been removed. When pressed on what she means, she becomes agitated and claims not to remember her own words. The winter passed with Margaret largely confined to her rooms. The child, now approaching 3 years old, was primarily cared for by Lucinda and occasionally visited by his father. According to Lucinda's later testimony, Charles began to demonstrate increasingly strange behavior during this period. He would sometimes stop in the middle of playing and tilt his head as if listening to something, she said. More than once, I found him having conversations with empty air, using words and phrases that seemed too advanced for a child his age. When spring arrived, bringing with it unusually heavy rains for the 2nd year in a row, the events at Duval Plantation accelerated toward their grim conclusion. On April 10, 1846, the river rose beyond its banks, flooding the lowlands of the plantation, including the area surrounding the cottage. Whitfield's journal experienced what he termed a complete nervous collapse. Called to the plantation in the early hours of April 11th, he found Margaret in a state of extreme agitation, insisting that the floodwaters were bringing her back and that what was buried is rising. Clarence Duval, evidently at the end of his patience or resources for managing his wife's condition, made arrangements the following day for Margaret to be transported to a private sanitarium in Virginia. Plantation records note the loss of several field hands who were swept away while attempting to secure equipment from the rising waters. It was during this flood that Margaret Duval, according to Dr. The documentation of this decision includes a letter to the institution's director describing Margaret's symptoms. Periods of perfect lucidity interrupted by episodes of paranoid delusion, particularly concerning our son and his safety from unspecified threats. She speaks of a woman named Sarah as if this person were somehow attempting to claim our child, though no such individual exists in our household or social circle. The arrangements for Margaret's removal were set for April 15th. According to Joseph, the entire household was engaged in preparations, packing Margaret's personal belongings, preparing the carriage for the long journey, and arranging for servants to accompany her. No one was paying much attention to the boy that day, Joseph recalled. He was supposed to be napping in the nursery, with the door closed to keep the noise of all the activity from disturbing him. What happened next was documented in a frantic note from Lucinda to Clarence, preserved among the plantation papers. Master Charles missing from nursery. Have searched all rooms. No sign. Back door to gardens found unlocked and open. Please come quickly. The search for Charles Henderson Duval began immediately and extended throughout the plantation grounds. According to multiple accounts, when Margaret was informed that her son was missing, she displayed none of the panic or distress one might expect. Instead, according to Dr. Whitfield, who was present to oversee her preparations for travel, she smiled in an unsettling manner and said simply, "She has come for what is hers." The search parties focused initially on the areas closest to the house, the formal gardens, the stables, the kitchen gardens. It was Joseph who suggested checking the path to the river cottage, remembering Charles's fascination with that forbidden direction. "Miss Margaret became like a different person when I mentioned the cottage," Joseph recalled. She broke away from the doctor, who was trying to keep her calm, grabbed a kitchen knife from a tray being carried past, and ran toward the path faster than I would have thought possible for a woman in her condition. The flooding had begun to recede, but the path to the cottage remained muddy and treacherous. According to multiple witnesses, Margaret ran ahead of the search party, her white dress becoming stained with mud as she repeatedly fell and rose again, never slowing her desperate pace. When she reached the cottage, the door was found standing open, a detail that seemed impossible to those who followed, as the key was known to be in Clarence's possession. Inside the cottage, according to the official report filed with the Chatham County Sheriff days later, they found footprints in the mud that had been carried in by the floodwaters, small footprints that matched the size of Charles's feet, leading directly to the corner where Joseph had previously witnessed Margaret prying up the floorboards. The boards were now missing entirely, apparently washed away by the flood. What remained was described in the sheriff's report as a small cavity beneath the floor, approximately the size of a storage trunk, now filled with muddy water. The report notes that the search party, led by Clarence Duval, immediately began to drain and search this space, fearing the child might have fallen in and drowned. What they found instead, according to multiple witness statements, were the partial remains of an adult female in an advanced state of decomposition, but preserved enough by the surprisingly cool, clay-lined space to be recognizable as human remains. Dr. Whitfield's official statement identified the remains as consistent with those of a young woman and noted evidence of trauma to the neck area, suggesting death by strangulation. Charles Henderson Duval was not found in the cottage. The search expanded to the surrounding woods and marshlands, with plantation workers forming lines to methodically cover every foot of ground. It was near sunset when a cry went up from the direction of the river. According to Joseph's account, he had spotted something unusual on the far bank, what appeared to be a child's shoe caught in the exposed roots of a cypress tree. The area where the shoe was found showed signs of recent activity, footprints in the soft mud that led both to and from the water's edge. According to the sheriff's report, these included the small footprints of a child, alongside what appeared to be those of a barefoot woman. The footprints led into the river itself and disappeared. Despite continued searching, Charles Henderson Duval was never found. The official report concluded that he had likely drowned in the river, either after wandering there alone, or more disturbingly, after being led there by an unknown woman who had somehow gained access to the plantation during the confusion of the flood and its aftermath. Margaret Duval was still transported to the sanitarium in Virginia as planned, though now accompanied by 2 attendants rather than just one. According to sanitarium records, she never spoke again after the discovery at the cottage. She died there 3 years later, in 1849, the cause listed simply as failure to thrive. Clarence Duval sold the plantation in 1847 and relocated to New Orleans, where he reportedly lived a solitary life until his death in 1860 from yellow fever. The plantation changed hands several times in the following decades. The main house was eventually destroyed during the Civil War, though local records show the cottage remained standing until the aforementioned fire in 1904. The mystery of what truly happened at Duval Plantation has never been fully resolved. The remains found beneath the cottage floor were officially identified as those of an unknown female slave, though many who knew the household personally had their suspicions about the woman's identity. No record exists of any investigation into how she came to be buried there, or who was responsible for her death. As for Charles Henderson Duval, his disappearance became the subject of local legend. Some versions of the story claim that on certain nights, when the river is high and the moon is full, the sound of a child's laughter can be heard near the spot where the cottage once stood. Others insist that what happened was more mundane, that the child simply wandered too close to the water and was swept away, a tragic accident rather than something more sinister. The most disturbing version of the story, however, comes from an account written in 1902 by an elderly woman named Harriet James, who claimed to be the daughter of Lucinda, the nurse who had cared for Charles. In her account, Harriet wrote that her mother had always believed that Sarah Turner had not died when everyone assumed she had. "My mother told me that Sarah had somehow survived whatever was done to her after the birth," Harriet wrote. "That she had been kept prisoner in that cottage, perhaps in that very space beneath the floor, alive but unable to escape. And that when the flood came, it freed her, allowed her to finally reclaim what had been taken from her." Whether this account represents truth, folklore, or the embellished memories of an elderly woman is impossible to determine with certainty. What can be verified is that in 1867, a woman matching Sarah Turner's description was documented living in a freedmen's community near Augusta, Georgia, with a young man she identified as her son. The census taker noted that the young man, whose age would have matched that of Charles Henderson Duval, had he lived, possessed remarkable eyes that seemed to shift between blue and brown depending on the light, a trait that several sources attributed to the missing Duval heir. The graves of Margaret and Clarence Duval are located in separate cemeteries, hers in Virginia near the sanitarium where she spent her final years, his in New Orleans. Neither grave, according to local historians who have documented the sites, has ever been found to be adorned with flowers or other tokens of remembrance. They remain as silent as the long-vanished walls of Duval Manor, keeping whatever secrets they may hold locked away from the light of day. The story of the Duvals and Sarah Turner eventually faded from public memory, preserved only in fragmentary records and the whispered stories passed down through generations of families who once lived in the shadow of the plantation. Today, the land where these events unfolded has been reclaimed by Georgia's relentless natural growth, the foundation stones of the main house barely visible beneath tangled vines, the site of the cottage marked only by a depression in the earth where no vegetation seems willing to grow. Perhaps it is fitting that nature has reclaimed this place of human cruelty and suffering, covering the physical evidence of what transpired there, while never quite erasing the emotional resonance that still seems to echo through the whisper of wind in the Spanish moss, the ripple of dark water against the riverbank, and the occasional sound that might be mistaken for a woman's soft voice calling a child's name. In 1875, nearly 30 years after the disappearance of Charles Henderson Duval, a journalist from a northern newspaper visited the area while researching a series on the changes in the South following the Civil War. According to his published account, he was directed to speak with an elderly man living on the outskirts of Savannah, who had once been a stable hand at one of the region's most notorious plantations. The journalist described Joseph as a man haunted by memories he has spent decades trying to reconcile, his hands trembling not just with age, but with the effort of holding back details he still fears to speak aloud. What Joseph revealed during this interview included several details absent from the official records, most notably his account of Margaret Duval's midnight visit to the cottage in December 1845, and his suspicion that Sarah Turner had not died immediately after giving birth, as most had assumed. This was Joseph, by then in his late 60s, who agreed to share what he knew of the events at Duval Plantation on the condition that his full name never be published. There were things that never made sense, Joseph told the journalist. If Sarah had died giving birth, why was her body hidden beneath the floor of that cottage? Why not bury her in the slave cemetery like others who had passed? And why did Miss Margaret become so frightened when the flood came? Not just the normal fear of rising water, but a specific terror, as if she knew something was coming for her. Joseph's most disturbing revelation concerned the night of Charles's disappearance. According to his account, he had been searching near the river when he glimpsed two figures on the opposite bank. A woman in a tattered dress, her hair wild around her shoulders, holding the hand of a small boy who showed no fear of her. Joseph claimed that when he called out, the woman turned briefly in his direction, and even across the distance of the river, he recognized the face of Sarah Turner, thinner and harder than he remembered, but unmistakably her. "She looked at me for just a moment," Joseph told the journalist, "and then she smiled, not in anger or triumph, but with a kind of peace I had never seen on her face when she lived at the plantation. Then she turned away, still holding the boy's hand, and they walked into the trees and disappeared." The journalist noted that he had attempted to verify Joseph's account by seeking records of a woman named Sarah Turner in the Augusta freedmen's community mentioned in earlier accounts, but found that the woman and her son had moved on by 1870, their destination unknown. "The last record of their presence," he wrote, was a note in a local church register indicating that donations had been collected to help Mrs. Turner and her son Charles relocate further west, away from the lingering shadows of their former life. While skeptics have dismissed Joseph's sighting as the product of a guilty conscience or an old man's confused memories, others point to the unusual circumstances surrounding the discovery of the remains beneath the cottage floor. Doctor. These notes, more detailed than his official statement, describe the condition of the remains as consistent with a body that had been stored in the space rather than one that had died there. More disturbingly, he noted evidence of restraint injuries to the wrists and ankles, suggesting the woman had been bound for some period before death. Most significantly, he wrote, "The advanced state of decomposition makes precise determination impossible, but certain characteristics of the remains raise the possibility that this body is not that of St, but rather another individual of similar age and build." This last observation has led some historians to theorize that Margaret Duval, in her increasingly unstable mental state, may have substituted another victim for Sarah, perhaps to convince herself that her perceived rival had been eliminated. Whitfield's original assessment that death had occurred due to strangulation was later questioned when his complete medical notes were discovered among his effects after his death in 1873. Church records from a parish approximately 15 miles from Duval Plantation note the disappearance of a young woman described as a free person of color who served as laundress to several local families in November 1845, around the same time as Margaret's midnight visit to the cottage. A letter discovered in 1922 among the personal papers of Elizabeth Mercer, the cousin who had visited Duval Plantation in October 1843, sheds further light on the increasingly paranoid atmosphere of the household during that period. Writing to her sister after returning to Virginia, Elizabeth described a conversation with Clarence Duval that had deeply disturbed her. "He spoke of Margaret as if discussing a business arrangement that had soured," Elizabeth wrote. "He said, she has become obsessed with the notion that the child is somehow not truly hers, despite all evidence to the contrary. She speaks of the Turner woman as if she were still present in our home, watching and waiting to reclaim what was never hers to begin with." When I asked who this Turner woman might be, his expression changed in such a way that I dared not pursue the question further. "A former servant," he said dismissively, "who left our employ some time ago." But there was something in his eyes, a wariness, a calculation, that made me certain he was not speaking the truth. Elizabeth's letter goes on to describe an incident that occurred on her final night at the plantation. "I was awakened well past midnight by the sound of a child crying. Thinking it strange that the nursemaid had not attended to him, I rose and went to the nursery, only to find it empty. both the child and his cradle gone. Following the sound of crying, which continued unabated, I was led to Margaret's private parlour. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap I observed a scene I still struggled to comprehend. Margaret sat in a rocking chair with the child held tightly against her chest, though his cries suggested the embrace was far from comforting. She was speaking in low, urgent tones, her lips close to the boy's ear. "You are mine," she repeated over and over. "Mine alone. She is gone and can never claim you." The child continued to cry, his small hands pushing ineffectually against her, until she suddenly began to sing, a lullaby I had never heard before, in words I did not recognize. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The child went still and silent in her arms, his eyes wide and fixed on some point across the room, though I could see nothing there but shadows. Elizabeth concluded her letter with an observation that takes on particular significance in light of later events. When I departed the next morning, Margaret embraced me with a coldness that belied our family connection. As I was about to enter the carriage, the child, who was being held by his nursemaid on the porch, suddenly called out, not to me, but apparently to an empty space beside the carriage. "Sarah," he said clearly, reaching out his small hand. Margaret's reaction was immediate and violent. She snatched the child from the nursemaid's arms with such force that the woman gasped aloud. "Never that name," Margaret hissed, though whether to the child or the nursemaid was unclear. "Never again." As my carriage pulled away, I saw her standing on the porch, clutching the boy so tightly that I feared she might harm him, her face a mask of such terrible fear and rage that I found myself offering silent prayers for the child's safety long after Duval Plantation had disappeared from view. The question of what truly happened to Charles Henderson Duval has never been definitively answered. The official record maintains that he drowned accidentally during the flood of 1846. Some local legends suggest a more supernatural explanation, that the spirit of Sarah Turner, unable to rest after her murder, returned to claim the child she had borne. Historians and scholars, working with the fragmentary evidence available, have proposed various theories ranging from kidnapping by unknown parties to the possibility that Joseph's sighting was accurate, and Sarah Turner had somehow survived her captivity to reclaim her son. A diary discovered in 1937, attributed to a woman living in Missouri in the 1850s under the name Sarah Williams, contains passages that some researchers believe may provide the final piece of the puzzle. The diary, now preserved in a historical collection at Emory University, includes the following entry, dated April 15, 1852. Exactly 6 years after Charles's disappearance, C. Asked me again today about the early years. I have never hidden the truth from him, believing that secrets poison the soul as surely as arsenic poisons the body. I told him what I remember of the manor house with its white columns and silent rooms, of the man who called himself master, and of the woman who believed that ownership could be claimed over a child's soul as easily as over a mother's body. I told him of the years in darkness, of the flood that became salvation, and of our journey north and then west, always west, putting distance between ourselves and the place where such things were permitted by law and custom. He listened as he always does, with that solemn intensity that sometimes makes my heart ache with memories of his father, not the man who claimed him, but the one whose blood runs true in his veins. "Were you frightened?" he asked, and I answered him honestly. "Every day, until the moment I found you again. Since then I have known anger, sorrow, exhaustion, joy, but never again fear." He nodded, as if this made perfect sense to him. This child who is no longer a child, but a young man of 9 years, with eyes that still shift between blue and brown, depending on the light. Later, as he helped me with the washing, he asked whether I ever think of returning east. The question startled me, for we have never spoken of such a possibility. "There is nothing for us there," I told him, and he was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Except justice," he said, and in his voice I heard an echo of determination that made me both proud and afraid. "We are free now," I reminded him. "That is its own justice." He did not argue, but I saw in his expression that the seed of an idea had been planted, one that I must find a way to uproot before it grows into a danger to us both. Subsequent entries suggest that C eventually abandoned whatever thoughts of return or retribution he might have harbored, instead focusing on education and later establishing himself as a schoolteacher in a small frontier community. The diary's final entry, dated October 1861, notes, "C departed today for the East, despite all my pleas. The war that has divided this nation has awakened in him a conviction that he must stand against the system that nearly destroyed us both. There are others still in chains," he told me as we said our goodbyes. "I cannot live in freedom knowing they remain bound." I watch the road long after he has disappeared from view, this child of my body who has become a man of principle and courage beyond anything I could have imagined during those dark days at Duval Plantation. I pray for his safety, but more than that, I pray that in fighting for justice, he does not lose the hard-won peace that has sustained us these 15 years. Whether C survived the Civil War is unknown, as the diary contains no further entries. However, military records from the Union Army include a reference to a lieutenant identified only as C. Williams, who served with distinction in a colored regiment and was noted for his unusual education and commanding presence. This officer was reported missing in action near Savannah in December 1864 during General Sherman's march to the sea. Local records from Chatham County during this period mention a curious incident in which a Union officer reportedly separated from his unit and was observed near the ruins of an old plantation on the Savannah River. A Confederate Scouts report describes encountering a Negro officer of unusual appearance and manner, who, when challenged, identified himself not by rank or unit, but by a name, Duval, that stirred distant memories. The officer escaped capture, and the incident was largely forgotten in the larger chaos of the war's final months. The land where Duval Plantation once stood was eventually parceled and sold to various owners after the war. By the turn of the century, most traces of the original structures had disappeared, reclaimed by nature or repurposed by new construction. Only the family cemetery remained intact, containing the graves of the elder Duvals and various relatives, but notably absent of markers for either Margaret or Clarence. In 1935, during construction of a bridge over the portion of the Savannah River that had once bordered Duval land, workers uncovered a small metal box that had been buried in the clay of the riverbank. Inside was a child's shoe, identical in description to the one found on the day of Charles's disappearance, along with a folded piece of paper containing a message written in a careful, educated hand. What was taken has been reclaimed. The circle is complete. The exact meaning of this message and how the box came to be buried at the river's edge has never been determined. Some have suggested it was placed there by Sarah Turner herself, perhaps during a return visit to the area that went unrecorded. Others believe it may have been the work of C. Williams during his brief presence in the region during the war. Still others dismiss it as an unrelated artifact or even a deliberate hoax created to perpetuate the legend that had grown around the Duval family tragedy. What cannot be disputed is that the events at Duval Plantation in the 1840s represented a dark chapter in a history already stained by the inhumanity of slavery and the complex, often tortuous relationships it created. The story of Margaret Duval, Sarah Turner, and the child caught between them transcended the usual boundaries between owner and owned, reaching into darker territories of obsession, psychological torture, and the devastating consequences of viewing another human being as property to be used and discarded. For the descendants of those who once lived and worked at Duval Plantation, those who survived to have descendants, the legacy of that place and time continues to echo through generations. Family stories passed down among the former plantation workers' children and grandchildren speak of Sarah Turner not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and eventual triumph. A woman who, against all odds, reclaimed her child and her freedom through a combination of patience, determination, and the unexpected assistance of nature itself. The academic community remains divided on how much of the Duval Plantation narrative can be verified through historical documentation versus how much has been embellished through retelling and the natural human tendency to shape chaotic events into coherent stories. What seems certain, based on the evidence that has survived, is that something tragic and deeply disturbing occurred within those plantation walls, something that left its mark not just on the individuals directly involved, but on the collective memory of a community. In 1968, an archaeological survey of the former plantation lands uncovered the foundation of what was believed to be the river cottage. Among the artifacts recovered from the site was a small silver locket containing a lock of dark hair and a tiny portrait painted on ivory. A woman's face, rendered with remarkable detail despite the miniature scale. Experts who examined the portrait identified certain features as consistent with surviving descriptions of Sarah Turner, though no confirmed images of her exist for comparison. Most disturbing was the discovery, beneath what would have been the cottage floor, of a shallow space lined with clay and containing traces of iron that suggested the presence of restraints. Evidence that supported Joseph's claim that Sarah had been kept prisoner rather than killed immediately after giving birth. The archaeological report noted that the space showed signs of having been deliberately designed for containment, with air channels that would have provided minimal ventilation while preventing escape. The last significant documentation related to the Duval Plantation tragedy comes from a letter written in 1942 by an elderly woman named Catherine Williams living in Seattle, Washington. Addressed to a historical society in Georgia that had placed a newspaper advertisement seeking information about certain antebellum plantations, the letter states, "I write regarding your inquiry about Duval Plantation, which appeared in the National Register of Historical Societies that I receive quarterly. I am the granddaughter of Charles Williams, formerly known as Charles Henderson Duval, and the great-granddaughter of Sarah Turner. The story of my grandmother's captivity and escape with her son has been preserved in our family through written accounts and oral tradition, though we have rarely shared it outside our immediate circle due to the painful nature of the events and the difficulty of proving what we know to be true. My grandfather did indeed return to Georgia during the Civil War, serving with the Union forces specifically to bring liberation to those still held in bondage on plantations like the one where his mother had suffered. After being separated from his unit near Savannah, he made his way to the ruins of Duval Plantation, where he left a marker that he later described to my grandmother as a message to close the circle. He survived the war and returned to his mother in Missouri, later moving west with her as the frontier expanded. I was born in 1875 and knew my great-grandmother Sarah for the first 10 years of my life. She was a woman of remarkable strength and dignity, who spoke little of her early life, but instilled in all her descendants a fierce commitment to freedom and justice. The gold locket she always wore contained not her own portrait, as some assumed, but that of her mother Esther, created by a traveling artist who had visited Duval Plantation in the 1830s. If your historical society wishes to record the true story of what happened at Duval Plantation, I am perhaps the last living person who can provide an account based on direct testimony from those who lived it. My only condition would be that Sarah Turner's story be told in full, not as a victim whose child was stolen, but as a woman who refused to surrender what was rightfully hers, and who found a way, against all odds, to reclaim both her son and her freedom in a world that denied her right to either. Whether the Historical Society ever responded to Catherine Williams's letter is unknown. It was found among uncatalogued papers during a reorganization of the Society's archives in 1959, by which time Catherine would have been 84 years old, if still living. No record exists of further correspondence or any attempt to record her account of the events at Duval Plantation. Today, the land where these events unfolded bears little resemblance to the cotton plantation of the 1840s. Modern homes and businesses have replaced the fields where enslaved people once labored under the Georgia sun. The river continues to flow as it has for centuries, indifferent to the human dramas that have played out along its banks. Only the ancient oak trees, draped with Spanish moss that stirs in the slightest breeze, remain as silent witnesses to a past that most have forgotten. Yet something of the story persists in local folklore, in the tales told by longtime residents about strange sounds sometimes heard near the river on particularly still nights, or the occasional sighting of a woman and child walking hand in hand along the old riverbank path before disappearing into the mist. Most dismiss these stories as the natural human tendency to populate familiar landscapes with ghosts. Others suggest that some events leave an imprint that transcends ordinary understanding, a resonance that continues to echo long after the participants have returned to dust. What remains beyond dispute is that the tragedy at Duval Plantation emerged from a system that permitted one human being to claim ownership of another, a system that corrupted not only its victims, but its beneficiaries, twisting natural human emotions like love, jealousy, and parental attachment into grotesque distortions. In that sense, perhaps the most enduring ghost haunting the former grounds of Duval Plantation is not any individual spirit, but the legacy of a moral catastrophe whose repercussions continue to shape American society nearly 2 centuries later. For those who study such histories, the story of Margaret Duval, Sarah Turner, and the child Charles serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and resilience, and of the fundamental truth that what is taken by force may someday be reclaimed, whether through the intervention of nature, the passage of time, or the unquenchable human spirit that refuses, even in the darkest circumstances, to accept defeat as final.